Hey, this is Jesse Toole for batchframe.com, and in this tutorial, I'm going to be going through rotoscoping in After Effects. Now, this isn't going to be a step-by-step tutorial. I'm not going to go through every single thing I went through to create this effect. We're going to be focusing on the rotoscoping. I'm going to be showing you a bunch of tips and tricks to speed up your workflow and make this a less painful process. A lot of people hate rotoscoping. It's one of those things that just has to be done. It's not too much of an artistic process. It's more of just a technical process of going through and cutting things out. But there are a lot of things that you can do to speed this up and make it easier on yourself so we can create this rotoscoping much faster and easier while still maintaining that accuracy. So let's get started. Here I have the original clip, which is just one of my friends swinging a tennis racket. And for this effect, what we want to do is get rid of any place where we see his skin, and we just want to be left with his clothes. So everywhere where we see him, we're going to be rotoscoping that out. So this is the clip we're going to be working with. Now you can see that there's a lot of motion blur. There is a camera move. We move in towards him. And that parallax shift makes the background replacement a little bit more difficult. But I wanted to use a clip that showed some of the more tough things that you might come across when you're doing your own projects. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about 3 different ways to rotoscope your footage in After Effects. The main thing we're going to focus on is using masks and doing the rotoscoping by hand. We're also going to be looking at rotoscoping using Mocha, and we're going to be looking at the rotobrush. So the first thing you want to do when you're getting ready to roto is just to watch through your clip. You want to plan out exactly what you're going to be doing to rotoscope your clip most efficiently. In this case, things are sort of simplified for us. Because we're removing pieces of our subject rather than keeping our subject itself, we're able to make wider mats than we would normally have to do. We don't have to be so tight because we're just getting rid of pieces rather than maintaining pieces. So things like motion blur, we can just work around rather than having to go in there and make sure everything's perfect. So this is a little simpler than some different aspects, but the main part of it is still the same. And we want to keep our masks as tight as possible still, just because we don't want to have to replace too much of the background. Another thing you want to look at when you're starting to rotoscope is where you can keep yourself from rotoscoping, what you can do to stop from having to create these individual masks. Now looking at this clip, one of the things we can do to save ourselves some time is rather than rotoscope out these legs, we can just key out this green background and save us from having to rotoscope out his legs. So simple things like that can save us time, keep us from having to rotoscope out every individual piece. And that's especially important when rotoscoping things like hair. Now in this case, this guy's got a short haircut. We don't have to worry about those stray hairs. But if we wanted to maintain detail in long flowing hair, it's almost impossible to rotoscope. That's not the kind of thing that's easy to do. Usually the hair takes up less than a pixel of space. So anything we're going to do with masks isn't going to work. If it's larger clumps of hair, you possibly could use your mask points and then go in and generate a stroke on that and possibly use a stroke to rotoscope out individual pieces. But for the most part, if you're working with hair, you're going to want to use some sort of keying effect in order to get that detail. So these are the things you want to think about when you're first looking at your clip. Another thing you want to think about is motion tracking. You can see here that we have a very shaky clip. So the first step that I'm going to take here is to get rid of the camera shake. Obviously there will still be some motion because he's moving, but if we get rid of the one aspect of the camera shake, it's going to make everything else a lot simpler. So I'm going to use one of the newer features in After Effects, and that is the warp stabilizers. So we're going to go to Animation, Warp Stabilizer VFX. You can also use the regular warp stabilizer, and you can see it's going through and tracking each of the 72 frames. So we'll skip ahead here. Alright, so this has completed its processing, and you can see it created this cropped clip, and that's not what we want. So we're going to change this from smooth motion to no motion. We're going to change the method to position, scale, and rotation. And we're going to go to stabilize only on the framing. So now all it's doing is shifting this clip around in order to get rid of a lot of that motion. You can see what it's doing. You can see that now the background is staying pretty still. It's giving a little bit of a weird effect because of the motion blur that was created originally. But for the most part, we've created a pretty static clip. Our main guy stays right in the center. And for the most part, all we have now is his movements rather than the movement of the camera. And that's what we want. Now, the problem with the warp stabilizer is that although it does a really good job of stabilizing the clip, it doesn't apply that data to the layer itself. You can see that it's actually moving the layer around within its boundaries. And for us to be able to use it more efficiently within our project, we want it to actually affect the position and rotation keyframes of our layer. And there's actually no way to do this built into After Effects. So I created a script for this, and it's available on the Batchframe website under the Extra section. And it's just called Warp to Keys. And it's a pretty simple script as far as the interface. And so we're just going to choose Apply to Layer, which is selected by default, and we're going to hit Warp Stabilizer to Keyframes. Alright, and you can see that the script has taken the data from the Warp Stabilizer VFX and applied it to the clip itself. So now rather than having the transform data happening within the clip itself, the footage itself, is moving around in our composition window. And that's what we want. That'll make it easier to attach other mats to it, other solids, other elements of our composition to that same track. You can see that the Warp Stabilizer VFX is still here, but we don't need that. Now obviously in the final version we're going to want that movement to come back. So let's set up our reverse stabilization by selecting this, and we're going to leave it at the defaults and choose Set up Reverse Stabilization. And so here's our new final comp, and you can see it's kind of jumping around like that, but that's because of the cropping that's happening in this composition. So what we're going to do is use another script. We can close that window. I'm going to create a mask that opens up this whole area. Use Auto Crop and Mask Crop. And you can see that that opened up our composition. And so now in this composition we have that full-size clip with the shaky camera move, but back here in our rotoing comp everything is stabilized. Now you can see right now we have a big area to work in, and we don't really need all that. So you can once again use Auto Crop to shrink this down to the size that we actually need. Okay, so now you can see our composition is a more manageable size. If we go back in here, let's close this one. If we go back in here, you can see it's a much smaller composition, but we still keep all of the video in frame. Alright, now that we're done with the setup, we can finally start working with masks. Now, one of the most important things while rotoscoping is to use several different masks rather than a single mask for the entire object. Now, in this example, we're sort of forced to use multiple masks in order to create our final matte. Because we're only getting rid of the areas with skin, you can see we're going to have a separate mask here, separate mask here, separate mask for each arm and the head. But you actually want to go further than that. We're going to create different masks for each piece of his arm. So the upper arm, the lower arm, and the hand for each arm are all going to be separate masks. Now, it might not be obvious exactly why we would want to do this, so I'm going to show you another example of why we'd want to use separate masks for each piece. Now here's another super exciting clip of a hand, and all it's doing is spinning. So let's say we wanted to rotoscope this. Let's see what happens when we try to rotoscope it with just a single mask. I'm not going to be doing this very accurately, I'm just going to be going through just to show a point. So we're creating this mask around the hands. And perfect, so there's our mask. Let's turn the type to none just so we can see the whole clip. So let's say that's our first frame, or actually on our last frame. So we'll start there, and we'll work our way back. And so as our hand turns, we're losing the spaces between the fingers. So what are we going to do with all these extra points? Well, you could, I guess, sort of try to shift everything around and work through this. But what's going to happen is you're just going to have a ton of points just bunched up around the top. And you can see here how messy this is and exactly what's going on. It's just going to be a huge mess, too many points. And you can't really delete points. If we go through and delete the points we don't need, you can see we get these warnings. And basically now if we go back to the start, the points we deleted stay deleted. So before I sort of had a shape of a finger going here, but since we deleted those points in this keyframe, they no longer exist here. So you can see that it's just going to be a big mess. Now, what you would want to do is use many different masks for each finger. So here I have that. Let's just get rid of these null objects. By using separate masks for each of the fingers and then the hand, Not only do we simplify the work when we're creating these masks, we're not doing a bunch of shifting around, and we're not getting any clumps of points, and it's just a much cleaner process. And because it is cleaner and it is simpler, you'll be able to work faster. Now I do want to talk a little bit more about adding and subtracting mask points. Let's create a new composition real quick. And I'll just create a solid. And I'm just going to create a simple square on here. Or four-sided shape. Anyway, so let's set a keyframe. And let's move forward. And let's add some mask points. And I'm just going to drag those towards the center. Now, if we go back to the beginning, you can see that we get that motion, but on that first keyframe, those mask points still exist. And if we go to a further point and then delete one of these mask points, you can see that we just completely lose the motion that we created in the second keyframe. Now, the reason for this is a setting in the preferences. So if we go to Edit Preferences and General, you can see we have this option, Preserve Constant Vertex and Feather Point Count when editing masks. So let's say I turn this off. And let's delete all these keyframes. And delete these mask points that we created before. And we'll set a new keyframe. So now let's do the same thing again. Move forward, create some points, move them inward, whatever you want to do. And now let's see, as we move back, once we get to that first keyframe, those mask points that we created are gone. As soon as we start moving towards the next keyframe, they appear. And that's great. That means that in cases where you're rotoscoping and you realize, whoa, I need some more points, you can go ahead and add those and it won't affect the previous part of the rotoscoping. However, when it comes to deleting these points, things are a little bit different. So I deleted that one as I did before. And now you can see we get this weird shifting of points as we go between these second two keyframes. And that's because of the way After Effects deals with mask points. Each mask point has an index, starting with the main point and moving around in the direction that you created it. So when we delete one of those mask points, the remaining ones shift their indexes and take the position of that point. So this is where it's kind of not very helpful to use that preference. I actually prefer to keep it turned on, which means that I can't dynamically add and delete mask points, but it just becomes a matter of keeping your masks as simple as possible, using as few points as you can. You can always add points without affecting the rest of the keyframes, but you can't delete them. Alright. So let's turn that preference back on. So back in our main project, now we know that we want to create separate masks for each part of this arm. So I'm going to start with this upper part of the arm. And we don't even include the sleeve because we're just trying to get rid of where his skin is. So let's create our first mask. And we're not going to create our mask on the video layer. We're actually going to create a new solid. And we're going to put our mask on here. Putting each mask on a separate layer will give you the most control later on. Now you can see that I turned the layer's visibility off. What this allows us to do is we can still create our mask right on here, but we can change the mask and move it along without having to re-render any part of our video. So if we go through and render this, we can work with our mask without losing any of that RAM preview. And that's only possible because we have this layer turned off. If once we turn it on, you can see that RAM preview is gone. And if we do the RAM preview again, and we're editing our mask, every time we move that mask around, we're going to lose our RAM preview. So keeping this layer off is going to help speed things up. We'll maintain that RAM preview. We won't have to re-render every time we make a change. So one last thing we want to do before we start to create this mask is to track the area that this mask will cover. Getting a solid track first takes away a lot of the work you'd have to do later on, especially if you can do an automated motion track. Now in our case, we're not so lucky. There aren't any good track points that we can use in this section of the arm.
so we're going to have to do a track by hand. But moving around a single null object is still a lot easier than moving around a bunch of mask points. So we'll create our null object, and we want this track to be as accurate as possible, but we're not going to be able to track any specific features, for instance the crease in his arm, because as his arm moves, we're going to lose that crease. So what's actually going to be most helpful as far as rotoscoping is to look at the area you're tracking as a whole and just keep the point in the center of that area. And the more accuracy you can get here, the better, but it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. As long as it generally follows the motion of your object, you're going to be saving yourself time.
So let's just create a position keyframe. And I'm just going to be going through this a couple frames at a time, moving the mask a couple frames at a time, and just trying to stay in the center of the area. Now you can see that it is sort of following that crease at this point, but once his arm opens up, it will change. So here you can see we've kind of lost that. And we're just going for the center of this little area right here. And I'm just using the page down key on my keyboard to go through this a frame at a time. If you don't know that keyboard shortcut, or you've never used it, and you're about to do some rotoscoping, you'll definitely get to know it really well. So here's another point where you can see we're just trying to stay in the center of this arm. We're not trying to follow anything specifically, we're just staying in the center of this block.
Okay, so there's our really quick track, and for this tutorial that's as far as I'm going to go. But I would usually go back and tweak that track to make it as accurate as I can, and sometimes I even like to animate the scale and rotation of the null object to make that track even more useful.
So now, let's label this as left upper arm track. And I'm going to parent that to the solid that we have. And another thing you want to do is just make sure, now here it's more than large enough, but just make sure that the solid you create is going to cover that area for the entire clip. So now we have our track, we have our layer, so let's create our mask. Create some more space here. So I'm just going to go through and create some points. I'm going to add a few more here because when the arm turns, we're going to need to have some detail in here to be able to animate. Just one for now, we can add more later if we need to.
And even though this is a curve, I'm just going to be creating
a point at one end, a point in the center, and a point at the opposite end.
And that's the mask that we're going to be working with. And you can see how simple it is, but that's exactly what we want. It's going to make it much easier to rotoscope with. Now another thing you should notice is that I didn't use any Bezier mask points, and that's because I find them difficult to work with. I often like to grab between 2 points to move the line. However, if they're Bezier mask points, you can see that it just bends the curve rather than moving the points.
So I'm going to stick with linear points. Now obviously in the end we're not going to want this to be linear, we're going to want those Bezier curves. So once we create all the keyframes, in the end, then I'll convert all of those mask points to Bezier curves.
And the way I'm going to do that is with another script I created called Toggle Bezier. So you can see right now that all of these points are linear points, but by clicking the Add Bezier button, we can convert all these points to Bezier curves. And by clicking the Remove Bezier button, we can convert them back to linear points. Now one problem with the automatic Bezier process is that it turns sharp corners into these rounded edges.
And the way around that is just to add an extra couple points at the corners.
Now doing this does add extra complexity to your mask, so if you'd like, you can actually wait until you're done with the rotoscoping before adding these extra points. But you can see by adding them, the areas at the bottom where we want these nice curves to happen are curved, and up at the top where we wanted that sharp corner, we still have that sharp corner. So I work with linear points, and then I add the Bezier at the end. So I'm just going to move that outside the window, and I like to sometimes flip back and forth
between the smooth curves and the linear points as I'm working, just to make sure that everything's working correctly.
So you can see here that I didn't create this keyframe on the first frame, and that's actually something you want to get into the habit of doing.
So let me go back to this first frame, and you can see there that motion track sort of already kept the mask where we wanted it. Now obviously there is still some work to be done, so let's reposition these points.
And you can see here that moving each of these points one by one is kind of wasting time.
What you can do instead is select groups of points, and we can double click, and you can see we get this little box that allows us to move all 3 points at once.
This mode also allows you to rotate and scale the points as a group. If all you wanted to do is just reposition the points, you can actually do that just by selecting them. You don't have to double click. And that'll just help you to work a little bit faster while you're editing your masks.
And so we'll just position the rest of these, and I'm just going for the edge of his arm. I'm kind of not worrying about the motion blur so much, and really for this project I could go right outside of the arm and just make sure I get all of that blur. But I also want to do as little background replacement as possible. So I want to keep these keyframes tight, and then once I'm done, I can change the mask expansion if I need to get a little bit more off of the arm. The main thing is you just want to be consistent between all your points. You don't want to have one point to be out here and the next point to be in here. You want them to all be as close to the same position on the edge as possible. And overall, the main thing you want to do is be consistent. If you're going to have the points here on this frame, when we go to the next frame,
You want to keep that same positioning.
you don't want to be way out here for one frame and then inside the arm for the next frame.
That would really mess things up later on.
The main thing you want to do is be consistent. If you're inconsistent, you're going to see it. If you're consistent, even if you cut off part of the arm, even if let's say we're trying to rotoscope his body out from the background, even if you were cutting off a piece of the arm, as long as you were consistent, it would probably still look fine. Now obviously we want to be as accurate as possible and maintain all of the arm if we can, but consistency is key when you're rotoscoping. So back in this first frame, it's pretty much set here. Once again, it looks kind of weird because our line is actually cutting off part of the shirt, but if we check that curved version, you can see that it really does follow the shirt itself. So another important thing that you want to do, it actually won't work if you don't, is to remember to set this keyframe. One of the worst things that can happen is when you're going through and rotoscoping and you realize 10 minutes in that you never turned on the stopwatch and you haven't been setting keyframes. Always a pain. So we have this first keyframe, and you can see our motion track sort of keeping our mask in place with that arm. I didn't do any scale keyframes, so you can see that our mask sort of shrinks down inside the arm. But the next thing I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go to the last frame, and I'm going to set the key for this frame. So you can see that I'm selecting all the mask points and scaling them as one. We'll position this top area as best we can. Select these guys, bring them down. And you can see that when I'm moving these points, I'm trying to move them perpendicular to the surface that I'm rotoscoping. You don't want to be sliding it around up and down. You kind of want to stay perpendicular to the surface that you're working on. So in this case, we can move it left and right. When we're on these bottom areas, we want to move it up and down. We don't want to shift it left or right too far. You want to stay working perpendicular to the surface you're rotoscoping.
And this is one of those things that goes into consistency. If we can maintain the position of the points at the keyframes, then those interpolated frames, the ones that After Effects is creating for us, are more likely to be in the right spot already. And so if we can keep this consistency in our keyframes, we're going to have to do less work because those interpolated frames are already going to be accurate.
Cool, so there's our last keyframe. So now, if we go and scrub between those, you can see for a lot of this, we're not perfect, but it's pretty close, so all the movement that we're going to have to do is going to be pretty minimal. Now, this is where the real work starts. We have our first keyframe, we have our last keyframe, and now we have to do everything in between.
Now, our goal is to use as few keyframes as possible and still get a perfectly accurate roto. And we don't want to have to go through every frame, but there is a chance that you might have to go through each one just to make small tweaks, but they should just be small tweaks. As much as we can, we want to make After Effects do the work for us.
Now, when we're deciding where to put these keyframes, you don't necessarily want to just go like 5 frames forward and do a keyframe every 5 frames. You want to think about how you would animate this mask if you were animating this object. Now let me show you an example of what I mean, because that's a little bit confusing to understand. I'm just going to create a circle. And so let's say we have this circle, and it's moving from up here to down here.
Now, this example sort of oversimplifies the point that I'm trying to make, but you can see that if you were going to rotoscope out this animation, you wouldn't set a keyframe for every single frame. First, you would create your mask, and once that's set, you would create your first keyframe. Then you would scrub forward to where the ball's animation ends, which is right there. And then you would move your mask to that second point. And just by setting those 2 keyframes, you've rotoscoped the entire animation of that ball, even though it's moved that long distance. Now, like I said, this is an over-exaggeration of the point that I'm making, which is that we're not just creating random keyframes, we're creating our mask's keyframes at the same time as our animation's keyframe. So when we're doing our rotoscoping in this case, we want to think about the animation of his arm. Where would the keyframes for his movements be? So if we scrub through here and we look for the point where the arm sort of changes its motion, changes direction, that's where we want our first keyframe to be, which is right around this point. So I'm going to go in here and edit this mask to set our first intermediate keyframe. And as I mentioned before, we want to try to keep these mask points in the same positions they were in the previous keyframe. So I'm just going to go through and move each one, sometimes move groups of points. I like to grab in between to move 2 points at once. And we're just going to try to maintain that consistency. And just don't forget, we're trying to keep that side-to-side movement as minimal as possible. We're trying to maintain perpendicular movement of our mask points. And there we go. There is our first keyframe. And if we go back and forth between the two, you can see by just setting those 2 keyframes, already our rotoscope is pretty decent.
Now we are going to have to go in and see in this frame it kind of slips away, and we'll move it up a little bit. But it's very small movements that we have to make. And that's what we want to keep it to. We want to make this process as simple as possible. So here, you can see that we are going through 5 frames, but we only needed to set keyframes on 3 of them. Whereas if we were going through this frame by frame, you would end up with a keyframe on all 5. And it's because we're putting thought into where we're placing our keyframes. Since we're putting them at these natural motion points, it allows After Effects to more accurately interpolate the frames in between. So we're just going to continue this process. You can see now the arm moves from here, and it only gets a few frames before it changes direction again. So we're just going to try to find that point where it changes direction, which is right about here, and we'll once again move our points. And every once in a while, I'll just check your curves. You can see here we're getting a little bit off, so I'll just move this up. Move that in, kind of bring these corner points closer to each other, and just keeping it consistent and accurate. And it's just a lot of going back and forth, setting those main keyframes, and then going through and looking for the frames that need a little extra work.
So you can see that we moved a little bit further in this one, and you should notice that one of the things I'm doing is I'm selecting groups of points and moving them together rather than moving them all around individually. And that's something that you should really get into the habit of doing. By selecting a group of points and double-clicking, you're able to freely transform the position, the rotation, and the scale of that entire group as a whole. And if you can do that, not only will it help things stay more consistent because you're moving everything as a group, so everything's staying proportional to each other, but it'll also help you work faster because you're moving the points as a whole rather than everything individually. So saves time and keeps you more consistent. You should try to do it as often as you can. Now, another thing that you want to make sure that you do is to lock the other layers in your composition. A bad thing that can happen sometimes is you move that background layer without noticing, and then you continue to rotoscope. And if I do this, and I continue on, then the roto for out here might be accurate, but then when we go back to the beginning, it's going to be off. So you really want to make sure that the position for this is set, and then locked. You want to lock all the other layers if possible. So the only layer that you can affect is the one with your mask on it. So I'm not going to make you sit here and watch as I go through this entire thing. As I've been saying, you just want to go through, find those key points in the movement of your object, set the keyframes, go through, tweak if you need to, but just keep things as simple as you can. I can't say it enough, if you keep things simple and you keep everything consistent, you're going to come out with a nice clean roto without having to do a ton of work. So now I'm going to move on to a completed version of this roto so we can talk about some other things you might run into while you're rotoscoping. Now, you can see that in this clip there's motion blur. Now, for this particular project, that wouldn't matter because we're trying to get rid of everything, including the motion blur of the arm. We don't want to get rid of the main part of the arm and leave the motion blur. We're trying to get rid of everything. So for here, this is fine. We don't have to do any more work. But in some cases, and probably most cases, you'd want to maintain that motion blur. And one thing about After Effects is that the masks actually can get motion blur without having to do any extra work. So let's turn this layer on, and you can see right now it's just static. And let's add that curve just to make it a little bit nicer. And we'll turn on the motion blur for the comp, and we'll turn on the motion blur for the layer. So you can see right there, the motion blur that's created by default is very close to the motion blur of the arm, which it should be because the mask has the exact same motion that the arm does. And you can see here that if I toggle back and forth, the motion blur is almost exactly the same. Now, if that didn't work out as nicely for your footage, one of the options you have is to change the shutter angle in the composition settings, and that'll change the amount of motion blur that After Effects gives to this mask. Another thing you can do that will give even more control is to use one of the newer features in After Effects, and that is the Mask Feather tool. So if you're using that for Roto, you'd probably want to turn off your motion blur, and let's go to an area that has some decent motion blur, such as right here. And just to make this easier to see, I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down to 50%. And so when you're rotoscoping motion blur like this, you're going to want to roto a little bit differently than what I had done. So let's actually turn this layer off. Now you can see there's sort of a solid area where the edge of the arm is, and then there's the motion blur that kind of comes out to here. So if you were rotoscoping this and you wanted to create the motion blur manually using the Mask Feather tool rather than using After Effects' default motion blur, you'd want to rotoscope to the edge that you see rather than rotoscoping to the edge of the motion blur. Now, I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to focus on this section right here. But you'd want to do that same thing for both sides. And then we're just going to go and use this Mask Feather tool. We'll create a point here at one end, create a point here at the other end, and then we'll just pull out the center area. Now you can't really see what it's doing here, but if we turn on the layer, you can see that it's creating that blurred look. And if we drag it out on this end and on this end,
let's turn this opacity all the way up. You can see we're creating that same motion blurred effect using this mask feather tool. So we can create the points exactly as we want them, and we can edit this motion blur to be exactly what we need. And this is keyframed the same way the mask is keyframed. It's actually connected to the keyframes of the mask. So as much as possible, when you're adding this sort of effect to your rotoscoping, you want to keep these keyframes where there already are keyframes for the mask.
And that'll just help to keep things simple as you're going through and editing your mask. And this is a case where having the preference to preserve mask and feather points turned off could actually be beneficial. Having the ability to create these points when there is motion blur and delete them when there's not is going to save you from having to deal with these points when they're not needed. Personally, I try to use the After Effects built-in motion blur as much as possible, and only if it's 100% necessary do I use this manual feathering. From my experience, most of the time the built-in After Effects motion blur works perfectly fine for almost every situation. Alright, so now that we've talked about the best ways to animate your mask and to create that roto, we're going to move on to taking the matte that we've created and applying it to the footage layer to affect its transparency in the way that we need.
So in the timeline, what you want to do is just make sure you have that matte layer directly above the video layer. And I'm going to hit F4 on my keyboard to bring up the track matte options. And we're going to change this from no track matte to alpha inverted matte.
And basically what that's going to do is cut a hole in our footage layer wherever our matte layer exists. And at the same time, it turns off the visibility for our matte layer so that we don't see that blue solid in our final product. Now, this works great right now because we only have one mask. But as I said earlier, you're going to want each of your masks to be on separate layers so that you can use different tracking data for each one and have complete control over each of your masks. The problem is that the track matte option only takes a single layer into account, and that's the one directly above the selected layer. But if you have several layers that are creating one matte, how do you apply all of them to your footage layer? Now, let me create another matte real quick. This isn't going to be anything in particular. I'm just going to create another mask on this layer. And I don't know, move it around a little bit. This is fine. Okay, so now we have two mattes, and what we want to do is select all three of these layers. We want to include that track layer because that affects one of our mattes, and we want to take all of them and pre-compose them so they're all in a single composition. So now we have a single layer with all of those mattes, and if we go in here, we want to make sure the visibility for all those mattes are turned on. And now back in our main composition, we can use this pre-comp as the alpha matte for our footage layer. So if we turn this back on and turn off the visibility of our pre-comp, you can see now that both of those mattes are being applied. Now, there might be another situation where you'd want to use alpha matte instead of alpha matte inverted to keep the area that we rotoscoped rather than creating a hole with the area that we rotoscoped. So you can see these are kind of the two options that you're going to be using. Now, if you'd like, you can actually create this pre-comp before you start and work inside the pre-comp rather than working in the main composition. The problem we have right now is that this pre-comp doesn't have the footage layer to use as a reference. So what we can do is go into our main composition, copy this video footage, and paste it directly into our pre-composition. So now you have this reference to work from, and if we change this layer to a guide layer, we can still see it inside the pre-comp to work from, but because it's a guide layer, it won't be visible in the parent composition. Only the two matte layers are visible.
So you can see that it's still a lot of work to get this roto done. However, if you follow the tips that I gave you, you're going to save yourself a lot of time, splitting up these different areas into separate masks. Using tracking data as much as possible will save you time when you're doing your roto, and it'll help make things more accurate and look better in the final result without having to go through and keyframe every single frame. Now, there are other tools in After Effects to help speed things up as well. One of the best is Mocha AE, which ships with the newer versions of After Effects. It's been doing it since After Effects CS4, and in some of the newer versions it's actually kind of hidden away, but it's a really useful tool for doing some types of rotoscoping. So, let's check out how to do this. We're going to select our layer, and it's the video layer that we want to send to Mocha, and we're going to go to Animation, Track in Mocha AE. And this is actually the only way to launch Mocha. You can't do it from the desktop. And I'm just going to leave the default options, just make sure the settings work for your project. So I'm just going to rotoscope one of his legs for this. So when we're doing Roto and Mocha, the first thing we're going to do is create a basic track. So we're going to go up to our X-spline tool, and we're just going to create a loose mat around the leg. It doesn't have to be accurate at all, it's just a very loose, wide mat around the area that we want to track. Okay, and you just right-click to end your mask. And you can see that we're already at the first frame, so I'm just going to track forwards. So our track is going, and at some point the leg is going to actually leave the frame. So that's going to cause a small issue in Mocha, but the track will still be fine. So you can see here we get this error, and that's what I was talking about. That's from that leg exiting the frame. There's nothing left for it to track. If we move down here, you can see that the leg is out of frame. But we got a good amount of the track before this happened, and we're just going to have to do a little bit of manual repositioning just to make this all work out. So we're going to move forward to where the track just starts to lose the leg. And we're going to move this point, trying to do as little as possible. For the most part, we want to leave it where Mocha set it. And so we're just going to do a little bit of work just to help move it along and get this part of the track correct. So I'm just going to set a couple of frames where it started to lose it, and then I'm going to track one frame at a time until the leg is out of frame. And let's zoom back out here, move up to the leg. So now you can see we have our leg tracked, but the mask we have around it, it's not tight enough to really be used as a mat for rotoscoping. So what we can do is now go through and create a more accurate mask. So I'm just going to zoom in here, and if you're wondering to zoom in like this, all you have to do is hold down the Z key and then left click and move the mouse up or down. So let's make sure we're at the first frame, and we'll create our mask. And in this case, you don't have to worry about using too many points. We already have that basic track that's going to do most of the work for us. So you can go in there, set as many points as you need to get all that detail in your object, and then we're just going to have to make maybe some small tweaks later on, and it's not going to be a big deal to have to move around a bunch of points. So make as many points as you need to capture that detail exactly as it is. So right clicking to finish that, and you can see we have a pretty tight mask around our leg. And in this layer, we're going to select the layer we just created, and in link to track, we'll hit layer 1. And you can see that just by doing that, we've created this highly accurate roto without doing much work at all. And our accurate mask that we just created stays with the leg without having to do any extra work. Now, in some places, we're going to have to come in here and do a little bit of editing, but for the most part, Mocha's already done all the tough stuff for us. It's just going to be going in and making a couple of small tweaks, and then we'll be set. So all we're going to do is go back through and edit that more accurate mask in the places where it's needed. So wherever it's kind of fallen off the leg, we're just going to go ahead and put it right back. And as long as you have this option, the automatic keyframe option, turned on, as you're going through and editing these points, you can see that the keyframe was created for us automatically, just like it would in After Effects. And so as we continue to go through here and make some changes, we'll get those keyframes set for us. And as long as you have a good initial track, the work you have to do here is very minimal. Now, I'm going to be showing you how to take this roto that we just created and apply it in After Effects. But if you'd prefer to create your masks in After Effects from the beginning, you can still use Mocha just for the motion tracking aspect of it. Earlier, we had to create that track by hand using the null object, but we could have brought that clip into Mocha, tracked it in here, and then exported just the tracking data to apply to a null object. And that would have saved us a little bit of time. So if you'd prefer, you can do it that way. But let's say we finished with this and we want to export our new mask. What we're going to do is we're going to export the shape data. We'll copy that to the clipboard. And you just want to make sure you have it for the selected layer, not all layers. And you can see we have it as the only option, which is the shape data for AE. Go back into After Effects. And we're going to be pasting this Mocha mask onto a solid in After Effects, just as we did before, so we have that individual mat. And we're not going to be using the edit paste command as you might think. We're actually going to be using the option here at the bottom, which is paste Mocha mask. So let's just create a new solid.
and we'll go over to Edit and down to Paste Mocha Mask. And right away you can see that this mask has been created just as we had it in Mocha, and it's tracked on the leg already. Everything is pasted in here just as we had it in Mocha a couple seconds ago. But now that it's an After Effects mask, we're able to use mask feathering, mask expansion, and everything else you can do to masks in After Effects, you can now do to this Mocha mask. And you can see here that it's a little bit off, but with a little bit more work in Mocha to begin with, we'll have a perfectly accurate mask here in After Effects without having to do very much work at all. And like I said, this mask is exactly the same as any other After Effects mask. We can change the mask expansion, we can change the mask feathering, we can give it motion blur, we can do all the other tweaks that we need to, but we're saving ourselves a ton of time because everything was automated for us in Mocha. And I would actually say that Mocha is probably your best option as far as speed is concerned. If you can get that initial track to work out, it's going to save you from having to do all that manual rotoscoping. But let's close out of Mocha for right now, and let's move on to talking about the final option for rotoscoping that I'll be talking about, which is the Rotobrush. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of the Rotobrush right now. I think it's a little bit slow to work with as far as how much processing it takes to use the Rotobrush as opposed to just masks or working in Mocha. There are some cases where I think it does a very good job, and I think it's slowly getting to the point where it's becoming a really useful tool. But at this point, I think there's a lot of things that it lacks. For instance, you can't take the final result and convert it into a mask shape. So you don't have the same level of control that you have over creating those masks by hand. And they have made some good improvements recently with things like the Refine Edge tool, but it still has problems when there's a lot of motion blur or there's low contrast between edges. However, this is a tool that's constantly improving, and it has a very different workflow from your standard rotoscoping, which is something I want to show you here. And in a case where it works well, for instance this leg, it actually does a very good job of creating the roto. So you're going to open up your layer, and we're going to choose this Rotobrush. And you can see I have the green circle. If I hold down Alt, it turns red. And basically, those are the two options you use to tell what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of. So you're not going to go through and paint a line around the leg. You're just going to create a line directly down the center. And you can see it automatically selects the leg. And as you're refining this, you'll probably need to change the size of your brush to fit into different areas. And to do that, all you have to do is hold down the Control key and then drag your mouse left or right, and that'll change the diameter of your brush. So to get into this small area of his leg, we'll just scale down our brush, and then we'll paint that part back in. So now we've added back in an area that the Rotobrush had left out. But there's also areas that we don't want that the Rotobrush has included. For instance, this part of the pants at the top. To deselect that, all you have to do is hold down the Alt key, and you'll get the red cursor, and then you just paint that area out. And so you just continue to add and subtract different areas until the roto is perfect for this first frame. Now, as we've been painting with the Rotobrush, down here at the bottom of this window, you can see that it's created a key, and that's our base frame. And this base frame is what After Effects continues to look to decide exactly how the Rotobrush is going to be applied to the current frame. And this is where the Rotobrush really starts to differ from the other methods of rotoscoping. As it goes along, the Rotobrush sort of learns from the previous frames. So it starts with the base frame, and as it moves on, each consecutive frame learns from all the frames that were before it. What this means is that we're not going to be jumping ahead several frames and setting more keyframes. We're going to watch it frame by frame and correct the errors as they occur. So let's go on to the next frame, and right away you can see that the Rotobrush sort of lost what we had in that first frame. You can see that there's a little bit of leg here that we lost. You can see there's a section that we don't want. And we want to correct these problems right now. As soon as they occur, we want to fix it so that the Rotobrush can learn from the mistakes it made in this frame. And this means that as you move on, you should notice the Rotobrush becomes more and more accurate. So once again, we'll just go one frame forward, and we're going to paint this out. Paint out what we don't want, keep what we do. And as we go along, you should notice the results start to get better and better. Now obviously this is really difficult for because the similarity between the red of the pavement and the color of his skin. And this is something we'll be fixing a little bit later, but you should notice things start to improve as you move along. So we'll just be going through and doing that. Now in After Effects CC, they added a new tool called the Refine Edge tool. And its name kind of explains it all, but basically what it allows you to do is select the edges of your rotobrush layer and refine those edges to get more detail in things like hair or motion blurred edges or jagged edges or areas such as what we have in low contrast, and it improves those edges and it gives you more accurate detail in areas that otherwise the rotobrush might have gotten rid of. Now to use this, you literally just take the Refine Edge tool and paint along the edges where you want them to be improved. And so you can see that as we paint along the edge of the leg, it creates this black and white matte where the contrast is enhanced and the detail is improved. And if by default the Refine Edge tool doesn't work out so well for your clip, you can actually go into the Effect panel and change some of the settings. In our case, the default settings are working just fine. And if we look at the area that we were having problems with before, you can see that the Refine Edge tool has done a great job creating contrast between his leg and the pavement, which before showed almost no differentiation.
Now, this is what the display looks like in our monitor, but if we go to that composition view, you can see that it's only maintaining the section that we've rotoscoped with the rotobrush. So that's the basics of how to use the rotobrush. Now, you'd want to go through every single frame and watch for each part where the rotobrush kind of loses detail and you want to paint that back in. But as you go through here, you can see how slow the rotobrush is to render. And there really isn't any way around that. Every time you make a change to the rotobrush, everything else will change also. So any RAM preview that you have is going to be lost each time you make a change. And even when you're done with the rotoscoping, there's still not really a way to cache everything out. You can't create a mask. There is sort of a hack to get around that, and you can go up to Layer and then down to Auto Trace, and that creates sort of a traced shape of the rotobrush layer that you just created. But it's a really ugly mask, and it's got a ton of points, and weird things happen, so it's not really a usable workaround. But yeah, the rotobrush, it's not perfect yet, but it's definitely improving constantly, and there's definitely some situations where it will save you a lot of time to use it. Alright, so this has been a very long tutorial, and it's only because there's so much that goes into rotoscoping, but I hope that you were able to pick up some tips and tricks that'll help to speed up your roto and speed up your workflow when you're doing this in your own projects. For me, rotoscoping is really fun because although it is a lot of work to get the final result, when you see those results, they're always really satisfying. And a lot of the effects you can create with rotoscoping, there really isn't any other way to do it. There's always green screen maybe, but that might not always work, or there might not be a budget for a green screen, or the lights to light it, or the location that allows you to use it. So having a tool like rotoscoping to create these effects are really important, and so I hope that the tips and the workflow that I showed you in this tutorial help you to get to those results faster. And one last thing before I sign off is, for those of you who are interested, I just want to give an overview of the steps I went through to create this particular effect. Okay, so here we are in the project that I worked on, and I'm just going to go through the different steps that I went through in order to create this final effect. So here we are with the original footage, and the first thing I did was just go through and rotoscope, which is what we went over in the last tutorial. So using all those techniques that I showed you, I went through and I rotoscoped the entire clip and got all the mattes that I needed to replace his body with the background. Now, I had this matte, so what I needed was that background to replace it with. And you can see here what I did was create this background plate that still has the same motion, but by cutting out and using different frames and different pieces of this footage, I was able to replace different portions of it that I can use in place of the rotoscoped areas from the last step. And there was a bunch of different techniques that I used to get these different portions. For instance, the trees, what I did was took a still image from when the trees weren't blocked and tracked them into the shot to match the movement of the camera. And I did the same thing for the pole on the fence behind him. In this one you can actually see sort of the matte from the tree, but this is actually in the end covered up by our character, so you don't kind of see that imperfection. Over here you can see that this pole is actually painted in, and this pole over here actually cuts off because we never replaced this section of it. The only part that I worked on is the section that is replaced. So I added this entire pole in, the sign had to be placed back in, parts of the net, and what made it difficult was that because we do have that forward movement in the camera, each piece had to be animated differently depending on how far away it was in order to match the same parallax shift. And so I ended up just doing a lot of working through and finding different pieces that I could use to replace other areas of the shot,
And you can see that
They're not 100% perfect, but because we're not using this imagery the entire time, only in the sections that need to be replaced based on our rotoscoping,
you can get away with some small areas not looking 100% real.
So basically, I created this replacement comp, which I'm going to use to replace all of the sections that we rotoscoped in this step.
And now if we take away these mats, you can see that they're replaced with the background that we created. And so now the issue is,
we still have all these holes, and you can see like the hand and the sweatband, all these holes that need to be covered up and replaced with parts of the clothing. This is sort of difficult, especially in this midsection where we need to replace clothing that's also moving. Now, what I did for the main section, the torso area, is there's actually a period of time where he opens his arms up and we can see the entire shirt. So what I did was I took a still frame of this section of shirt, masked out just the area that I wanted to use, and then I used the puppet tool to create that area of the shirt. So if I solo this, you can see the section of shirt that I cut out, and you can see that it's just been animated using the puppet tool to get this nice bending transformation. And the puppet tool actually worked out really well, and it really gives some nice realistic movement to the flowing shirt. So also, I had to paint in backs of clothing. For instance, down here on both legs, there's a section of the inside of the pants that was covered up by the leg. So what I did, and you can see when I turn this layer on that it just comes in, this is actually just painted by hand using the paint tools that are right here in After Effects. So if I solo this, you can see it's basically just a single color. At some points when we got to see a larger area of the pants that were missing, then I would go in and add a few more different colors to them. But for the most part, it's really just a single color replacement where I'm just going in and painting directly on the layer. I would just do something like this where I would select an area of the pants and I would just paint right over top of the missing area in order to create that new part of the pants. And in the end, even though it was so simple, it actually works out and just looks like the backside of the pants. And I did that same thing for sections of shirt where when he swings, you can see here that we should be seeing the inside of the sleeve. So if I turn on the sleeve painting layers, I did the exact same thing where it's just a matter of creating this interior, and it's really just some solid colors. Possibly not exactly how it would look in real life, but it works for the situation, especially when you're viewing it at that normal scale. And you have to remember that when you're doing your projects, there are things that you'll notice while you're working on that will possibly bug you. You have to remember that you've looked at your footage way more than anyone else has. You've looked at this roto, you've looked at this replacement more than everyone else, and they're not going to notice some of the smaller things that may pop out to you. For the back of the shirt, I did the exact same thing that I did for this front section, where I just took a picture of the back collar and I used the puppet tool to animate that and put it right into the scene. The sweatbands and the tennis racket had to do something a little bit more drastic. I actually found it was easier to just recreate the entire tennis racket rather than trying to just replace single parts. So all I did was took some reference pictures of my tennis racket and went into Maya and just recreated the tennis racket and literally tracked by hand the tennis racket right into the scene. So if we look at this frame, here is what's left of the real racket, and I just went through and put the CG racket right over top, and I got this final look, and then just rendered that out and literally just placed it right on top of what was already there. So I didn't actually rotoscope out the entire tennis racket. It's actually still there right behind the CG one that I put in. And because the CG one looks identical, for the most part, to that original tennis racket, and the motion's exactly the same, I don't have to do any additional roto to that tennis racket. I can just leave it pasted right over. And I did the exact same process for the sweatbands. It was just a matter of getting the texture to something that looked realistic, but the tracking process was the exact same. I just created a simple piece of geometry, which is just a pipe shape inside Maya, tracked by hand to the actual wristbands that were there, and that's it. I just rendered that out. It took a little while to try to match the sort of lighting that we had in our actual footage, and then it was just a matter of doing a little bit of compositing to get things to work. Such as when the tennis racket goes up into the sky, we want to have some of this blooming of light over top of the racket in order to make it fit better into the scene, because that's what would happen in real life. You can see that without this effect, it kind of just looks like it's placed right on top of the scene. But once we add that bleeding of light over top of the racket, everything sort of starts to meld and blend together, so it looks a little bit more realistic. Another important thing to do is to add noise to the pieces that don't have it already. For instance, the CG elements or the still frames, they don't have noise to match the original footage. And although the noise in the original footage isn't extremely noticeable, when you see it side by side with something that doesn't have noise, you can tell that something's off. So adding in that noise is one of those subliminal effects that's really going to help things meld better in the final result. It also helps just to roughen the edges of your CG elements just a little bit to match and make them fit into the scene as everything else does. And I also like to give a final color correction to the entire scene once the composite's done, so that the colors match and everything blends just a little bit better. But yeah, other than adding in the tennis ball at the very end, that's pretty much everything that I went through to create this effect. Alright, but I think I've taken up enough of your time. You should get out there and do some rotoscoping of your own. If you have any questions or any comments or need to know anything that I didn't cover in this tutorial, please feel free to send me an email at contact@batchframe.com or just leave a comment on the blog and I will do my best to get back to you. Once again, my name is Jesse Tula for batchframe.com and I will see you in the next one.